This would be for a two-piece plate, either for the top, which is always two-piece, or for a back where it's going to be a two-piece versus a one-piece. So we saw down the center of that using a bandsaw or a handsaw of some type. When we take those two pieces of wood, we just open them up like a book. So we call that book matched. And you can see that flame, the curl, the figure running down on both sides. The surface of that wood, what we call the inside surface, would be the inside of where those two pieces came, are flattened, at least roughly, and then the edges are planed so that they become square for gluing. This is the finished piece of wood glued together. And then once it's glued together, we again flatten it again to make sure it's perfectly flat in all directions. There's no twist. That means the wood isn't higher in one spot than the other. And I actually use a piece of marble to test it on, because marble is perfectly flat. I actually just bought myself a little one of those dough marble things you use in the kitchen. The instrument is built around a form. We start with a pattern, which is a half of an instrument, and then that pattern is flipped over, and that way we can make both sides of the form exactly the same. It's just a piece of plywood that the instrument's built around so that everything remains square and doesn't twist and get out of shape while we're working on it. It takes about 150 hours to make an instrument, so you don't want it to be sitting for a long time and getting out of shape. You can see the blocks are glued onto the form. There's 6 of them, 4 in the corners, 2 on the ends, and they're glued onto the form as a temporary measure until much later on when we take the form out. This is just trimming one of the blocks. You can see down here, there's the shape is marked onto the block, and then we trim the block to receive that, to get to that shape. This is now ready for the center piece of wood, the rib or side, to be glued in. The sides that are made out of maple need to be planed and then scraped to a final thickness. That final thickness is somewhere between 1 and 1.2 millimeters thick. So they're pretty thin. We just use a piece of metal that has been sharpened. It's blue spring steel. It's just it's very springy. It's basically a metal spring. And just put a sharpened edge on it, and it creates these shavings just from the scraper. Then the wood is bent. You can see here it's being placed into a strap and bent around a hot iron. This is one of the more modern conveniences. It's electrically controlled with a heating element so that we maintain a constant heat. Back in the days of Stradivarius, he had a steel form close to the shape that he wanted. He'd heat that up in the coals, clamp it into a vise, and then bend the piece of wood around it. He might have to go back and forth 3 or 4 times because the metal may have gotten too cool and has to be heated up again. The wood is wet, so that when you put it up against the iron, you get steam, and that steam pushes through the wood. When all the water's gone, your wood is bent and will stay that way. Here is the bent lower rib, ready to be glued onto the form. You can see up here the center rib is already ready and waiting. And here are 3 ribs glued on, or being glued on. The others in the C-bouts are already glued, and these are being glued on. My fancy glue pot, a little coffee warmer, a 1 cup measuring cup, and a baby food jar. Very high tech. And here are the finished, or the glue, the ribs all glued on. You can see that there's still some of the wood extending beyond where it needs to be here. And this is the finished set of ribs, all trimmed and ready. When you get all these things glued on there, you may not have a perfectly flat gluing surface because it just slight changes, or you didn't get it pushed down all the way, so that the edge surface, this edge and the edge where you can see me planing, need to be flattened so that they will match the plate that they will be glued to, either the top or the back. Most of my shop is in the little garage, little golf cart section of the garage, but I did usurp a little bit of the rest. Thank goodness we only have one car. The linings are a structure on the inside that helps support the both the gluing surface for the top and back. It kind of gives you extra width, and because the ribs are so thin, they give a little bit extra strength, and because it's so lightweight, they don't really affect the vibrational part of the instrument. Everything on the instrument affects the sound somewhat. If you were able to leave the linings off, it would make a difference. If you use too thick of the linings, it would make a difference. If you make the ribs 1/10 of a millimeter thicker, it'll affect the sound. Everything affects the sound. The materials that we use for the linings are either spruce, basswood, or willow. I prefer willow because the grain in it is a little less pronounced. It's easier to cut, especially for the blocks. And with the linings, you just basically use the same wood for both blocks and linings. I happen to have cut down a willow tree up in Michigan back in 1978. I'm still using wood from that tree. Here are the linings that are bent. Basically bend the linings the same as we bend the ribs. And they're just a little bit thicker than the ribs. The ribs 1.2, the lining is about 1.8. That's millimeters. Gluing in the linings, again, very high tech. Clothespins with rubber bands. And this is the finished lining detail after it's been glued in and trimmed down. You can see the lining here is actually set into the block, and a little bit here too. This is because we found out in the middle, instruments that were made in the middle 1800s, early 1800s, were made very fast, a lot of them. And we found that these linings, especially the center ones, were coming loose because they did not do this. So in order to keep that from happening ever again, pretty much every violin maker will do some form of this. Some of them do them just a little bit in here, like this. Some do them more like this. I like this. I think it looks nice. No one's ever going to see it, but I like it. Once the ribs have been planed down flat, then they're set on the plates, either the back or the top, depending on which side we're working on, and then we trace the outline. You can see I'm using a little washer here. It's just to give me an even shape all the way around. This is about 3 to 4 millimeters outside the edge, and that'll create the overhang that you have on the top and the back of the violin. Guitars don't have an overhang. They're flat, where it makes them a lot harder to take apart. The violin is meant to be able to be taken apart. Everything that is glued on it is glued together with animal hide glue, horse hide basically. There are other glues similar, rabbit glue, but it's all animal based. Sorry people. After the outline is put on, we trim around the whole outline, cut it out. This happens to be just a small handsaw. The bandsaw works great too. I'm in the process of writing a book on violin making, specifically for the novice, and I'm trying to design it so that they don't have to go out and buy every single thing that's out there, all those modern conveniences. So a lot of these pictures are also designed for that book, so that they can use lesser equipment, lesser tools, like the handsaw there. So this is the plate that's fully cut out. Now, if you remember from the plate, You see how thick it is here? Well, when you cut it out, it's going to still be thick on the ends. But everything on the violin is carved. There's nothing bent on it except for the ribs. So all this extra wood needs to be cut down here and cut down here. So we first start off with creating an even thickness all the way around the edge. This is about 4 millimeters thick. This is one of the few things that I do with a piece of machinery. And I designed one back in Maryland that I sold when I sold the shop. I handed my keys over to the new owners of the shop and I said bye-bye. And so I didn't carry anything away with me. So I kind of had to start over when I came down here. This can be done by hand with chisels and a file, but I hate that work. It's so boring. So I was going to make up another one of these things, and about 3 weeks after I got down here, I ran into Ike. I don't know, I forget Ike's last name right now, but Ike here. Anyway, he was getting rid of a really perfect tool that I was able to adjust to do this. I didn't even know until after I had built my original one that you could actually buy them, because I didn't know what it was called, so I designed my own. Anyway, once that edge is done, then we carve this curve into it using a gouge, and come from that ledge here and work our shape into it. So we're now creating that actual curved shape that everybody is familiar with. After the gouge, we use finger planes. These are very small, as you can see from them being in my hand. I brought them here, they're on the table, so later on you can take a look at them too. This is using one of those finger planes to plane down the top and to get it fairly smooth. And then we use smaller scrapers to scrape that wood even smoother. This is still being done on the rough side because we still haven't scooped out anything on the inside. And now we do a little bit of that. I drill some holes, and then to a depth close to what I want the thickness to be, but still a little bit extra. And then I just carve that out again with the gouge and with the finger planes. Then we add all around the edge of the instrument what we call purfling. It's a decorative border that's made up of 3 strips of wood, a black, a white, and a black strip, basically ebony and maple. And those add a distinctive fancy edge to it, plus they protect it because if you bump the instrument, you're less likely to put a crack in it very easily with this purfling there. It's inlaid down into the plate. I told you the top or back is about 4 millimeters on the edge. This inlay goes down half that down so that it's a full 2 millimeters down into the plate. And there are some makers over time that have done very, very fancy ones down into the back and all that, but it actually can hurt the sound because it interrupts the vibrational patterns of a piece of wood. So that's generally done for show, not for an instrument to be played. Here's where we mark the purfling. This tool here has 2 blades, and so it puts 2 lines, kind of like railroad tracks, all the way around the edge. So we have a guide to cut by. This is an alternate tool for that. This is the one I got from Ike. I made it so that it would have a foot pedal so that I have both my hands free to hold onto the instrument and move the instrument around. And otherwise it basically just can plunge down into the piece of wood as I move the wood around. But it also can be locked in place, and that's how I did that even thickness all around the edge. This is, we can only mark with the marker up to this point where they join. Then this is marked by hand. And then we cut along those lines with our knife. Or with that tool I mentioned that I got from Mike. But the corners always have to be done by hand because there's no way you're going to get a tool, a power tool in there to cut all the way to that very, very fine point. Then after those 2 lines are cut down deep enough, Then we pick out that extra wood. It's just cleaning out the groove. And here's the finished groove. And this is the purfling. As you can see, it's got that black, white, black. There are three pieces that are glued together. They're bent just like we do the ribs. And they're glued in here. And this is what we call the bee sting, where the two pieces come together and you have a fairly invisible joint right here. Then we do what we call channel, which is a little bit of three-dimensional cut-in, because the shape of the instrument is going to come up from this point, and then it will be rounded over on this edge. This has to be a very, very even distance all the way. This is the finished channel detail before we carve. And when we carve this back again, we're going to take that gouge and scoop this way to make this a smooth transition again. Another reason why we didn't finish the thicknesses before, because we were going to be changing things. This is a kind of a little drawing I did. Here's your original thickness. And we have the purfling, which was inlaid at this point and came down 2 millimeters. So it's half the thickness. Then we do our channel, and then we scoop it out to even it up. And here's the finished detail, including the rounded over edges. We then lay out the location of the F-holes, the location, the width, the length. All these things affect the tone. If they're too close together, the instrument's going to be weak and pinched. If they're too far apart, it's just going to be dull. If they're too long,